You people always think money makes you special. Victoria Whitmore's voice carried across the cul-de-sac before I even shut off my pickup. The cold morning air felt heavier than it should have. A line of neighbors stood along the gravel driveway, coffee mugs in hand, pretending not to watch while watching every second. My black Lamborghini sat in the center of the street with bright orange violation stickers plastered across the windshield and driver's side window. One of the HOA contractors was still peeling tape from the paint. The lake wind coming off the water behind the subdivision carried the smell of wet cedar and fresh rain. Victoria adjusted her pink blazer, lifted her clipboard, and smiled like she'd already won. Community standards apply to everyone, Nathan. I looked at the car. Then I looked at her. Community standards don't usually include damaging private property. Her smile widened. Then maybe you should call your lawyer. A few people laughed nervously. Not because it was funny, because nobody wanted to be the next target. That was Victoria's real power. Fear. Not rules. Fear. The kind that spread quietly through neighborhood Facebook groups, HOA hearings, and whispered conversations beside fishing docks and mailboxes. The contractor backed away from the Lamborghini. Rainwater slid from the metal roof of the clubhouse nearby with a steady ticking sound. Victoria took a step closer. You've ignored 3 notices. I received one. According to our records, 3. There was something in the way she said records that bothered me. Not anger. Confidence. Practiced confidence. The kind that comes from believing nobody will challenge you. I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the windshield. Then another. Then another. The crowd shifted. Victoria's smile tightened slightly. She expected outrage. She wanted outrage. Instead, she got documentation. That seemed to disappoint her. That won't help you, she said. Maybe not, I answered. But facts usually help somebody. Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the lake. Low and distant. The kind that rattles windows before a storm reaches shore. For a moment, nobody spoke. You could hear water hitting docks down near the marina and tires moving across wet pavement on the county road beyond the subdivision. Then one of the neighbors quietly said, "He's right." Victoria turned immediately. "Excuse me." The man lowered his eyes. Nobody wanted direct conflict with her. Not yet. If you've ever lived under a board president who mistakes authority for ownership, you know exactly the type. Comment below with your city and let me know if you've ever dealt with someone like this. Because what happened next changed everything in our neighborhood. Victoria recovered quickly. She always did. The vehicle remains in violation until removed, she announced loudly for the crowd. Daily fines begin tomorrow. Then she handed me a packet. Thick. Official looking. Deliberately intimidating. I flipped through it without reacting. Hearing notice. Fine schedule. Enforcement language. A lot of paper. Almost too much paper. As Victoria turned away, satisfied with her performance, a woman near the back of the crowd caught my eye and gave the smallest shake of her head. Not disagreement. Warning. Then she mouthed 4 words I'll never forget. Check the security cameras. And just like that, standing beside a half-soaked Lamborghini worth $500,000 under a darkening sky, I realized this story wasn't about a car anymore. The woman disappeared before I could ask her another question. 1 second she was standing near the mailboxes. The next she was walking toward the lake path with her head down and her hands buried in her jacket pockets. The crowd slowly broke apart. Pickup trucks pulled away. Garage doors closed. Conversations moved indoors. But the feeling stayed. That heavy feeling that settles over a neighborhood when everybody knows something is wrong and nobody wants to be the first person to say it out loud. I drove the Lamborghini back onto my property and parked beside my detached garage overlooking the water. Fog drifted across the lake in slow gray bands. The fishing docks were nearly invisible through the mist. Rain tapped softly against the metal roof while I stood in the garage staring at the damage. The stickers did not bother me. The scratches did. Somebody had crossed a line. And judging by Victoria's confidence, she believed nobody could prove it. By late afternoon, my phone had become strangely quiet. Normally, neighbors waved when I passed. That day, they looked away. 2 people canceled plans we had made for a community cleanup project. Someone removed me from a neighborhood group chat. Victoria had not just targeted my car. She was shaping the narrative. That realization hit harder than I expected. I poured coffee from a thermos and sat in the garage listening to rain and distant thunder over the water. The anger was there. Quiet. Controlled. But underneath it was something else. Exhaustion. I had spent years building a peaceful life after service. I was not afraid of conflict. I was tired of people creating it. Around 6 o'clock, my security system notification appeared. Front gate camera. A vehicle entering the driveway. Not Victoria, the woman from earlier. She introduced herself as Linda Mercer. Mid-60s. Retired school secretary. Nervous enough to keep looking over her shoulder while we talked. She handed me a flash drive. I should have done this a long time ago, she said. Done what? Her eyes drifted toward the lake. Stopped being afraid of her. Then she left. I stood there holding the drive while rain rolled across the shoreline. 10 minutes later, I loaded the files. What appeared on the screen was not what I expected. It was not footage of my car. It was months of recordings from various HOA meetings. Residents being interrupted. Questions being shut down. Votes rushed through without discussion. People publicly embarrassed for minor issues. One clip caught my attention immediately. Victoria was discussing enforcement authority. A board member quietly challenged her interpretation of the rules. Victoria smiled and said, "People comply faster when they think consequences are already decided." The room laughed nervously. My stomach tightened. That was not enforcement. That was intimidation. Then another clip appeared. Different meeting. Different month. Brad Whitmore sitting in the back row. Victoria's son. He leaned over to another resident and pointed toward my property on a neighborhood map hanging on the wall. The audio was weak, but one sentence came through clearly. That lot would be perfect once he leaves. I replayed it 3 times. Outside, thunder rolled closer across the lake. For the first time all day, Victoria's confidence made sense. This was never about compliance. It was never about community standards. And judging by what I had just seen, my car was only one piece of a much larger plan. The storm finally arrived just after midnight. Rain hammered the metal roof above the garage, and fog rolled off the lake so thick the shoreline lights disappeared completely. I barely slept. Not because of the Lamborghini. Not anymore. I kept thinking about that recording. That map. That single sentence from Brad Whitmore. By sunrise, the neighborhood looked different. The same houses. The same gravel driveways. The same fishing docks stretching into gray water. But now I could see the pressure underneath everything. People were not avoiding me because of a car. They were afraid of choosing sides. Around 8 o'clock, I drove to a small diner 3 miles outside the subdivision. The kind with worn booths, coffee refills every 5 minutes, and regulars who tracked local politics better than most newspapers. Rain streaked the windows. A courthouse sat across the street through the mist, its brick walls darkened by the weather. I was halfway through breakfast when somebody slid into the booth opposite me. Gary Holloway, one of the HOA board members. Retired contractor. 70 years old. Quiet reputation. Serious face. He looked exhausted. "You should not be seen talking to me," I said. He gave a humorless laugh. "That advice is probably 3 years too late." For a moment, he stared out the window at the rain. Then he lowered his voice. "Victoria thinks she owns that board. Does she?" He looked back at me. Most days. That was the first time somebody inside the organization had openly acknowledged what everyone else whispered. Gary did not hand me documents. He did not bring evidence. What he brought was context, which turned out to be more dangerous. Over the next 20 minutes, he described a pattern. Residents pressured into compliance. Selective enforcement. Certain properties targeted more aggressively than others. Every story sounded different. Every outcome sounded the same. Victoria always benefited. "Why tell me now?" I asked. He stirred his coffee slowly. "Because she is getting reckless." The answer sat with me all morning. Reckless people make mistakes. Careful people build systems. Reckless people expose them. When I returned home, 2 residents were standing near my mailbox pretending to discuss landscaping. They stopped talking the second they saw me. One nodded awkwardly. The other walked away. The gossip was spreading faster than the rain. By afternoon, the neighborhood social page exploded with speculation. Some blamed me. Some defended me. Others demanded explanations from the HOA board. For the first time, public opinion was no longer moving in one direction. Victoria's control was slipping. Then came the message. Not from Victoria. From Brad. It arrived through a neighborhood thread visible to dozens of residents. Only one sentence. "Some people do not belong here." Nothing illegal. Nothing overt. Just enough entitlement to reveal exactly who he was. Within minutes, replies appeared. A few supported him. More challenged him. Then something unexpected happened. Residents who had stayed silent for years started speaking. Small stories at first. Strange finds. Selective warnings. Public embarrassment during meetings. The thread kept growing. I watched it unfold while standing on my back deck, overlooking the water. Cold wind pushed across the lake. Rain rippled the surface. And for the first time since this started, I realized Victoria had a problem she could not issue a violation notice against. People were beginning to compare notes. The next morning arrived under a blanket of low fog that sat heavy over the lake and refused to move. From my back deck, the fishing docks looked like shadows floating in gray water. The neighborhood felt quieter than usual, but it was the kind of quiet that comes before something breaks. My phone started buzzing before 7. Not messages from friends. Screenshots. Residents forwarding comments from the neighborhood page. The discussion from the night before had exploded. More stories. More complaints. More people finally willing to attach their names to things they had only whispered about before. Victoria responded exactly the way I expected. She posted a long statement about protecting property values, maintaining standards, and combating misinformation. It sounded polished, professional, reasonable. That was her gift. She never sounded controlling until you looked at the consequences. By noon, another message appeared. This one was directed at me personally. She announced an emergency HOA meeting for Thursday evening and encouraged all residents to attend. The wording was careful, neutral on the surface, but everybody understood the target. The social pressure intensified immediately. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact 3 days earlier were suddenly watching from porches and driveways. People wanted to know what would happen next. They just did not want to be caught choosing the wrong side. Around lunchtime, I drove to the marina for coffee. The rain had returned, turning the shoreline muddy and slick. Wind pushed across the water hard enough to rattle loose ropes against dock posts. As I walked back toward my truck, somebody called my name. It was Mark Jensen, former board treasurer, resigned 2 years earlier. I knew him casually, but never well. He looked nervous, the kind of nervous that comes from carrying something too long. "You got a minute?" he asked. We sat inside his pickup while rain tapped against the windshield. He stared straight ahead. "Victoria is going to make Thursday about your car." I assumed that. He shook his head. "No, she needs it to be about your car." That caught my attention. Mark finally turned toward me. Because if residents keep comparing stories, they start asking questions she cannot control. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The marina disappeared behind sheets of rain outside. Then Mark handed me a small notebook. Nothing official, nothing dramatic, just handwritten dates, meeting notes, personal observations, the kind of thing an accountant keeps out of habit. "I started tracking discrepancies when I was treasurer," he said quietly. "At first I thought they were mistakes. And later," his jaw tightened, "later I stopped believing they were mistakes." That afternoon I sat in my garage overlooking the lake reading page after page while thunder rolled across the water. The notebook did not prove wrongdoing. It proved something almost as important. Patterns. Certain residents received warnings others never received. Certain complaints disappeared. Certain decisions always seemed to benefit the same small group of people, including Brad. The realization hit differently than the damage to the Lamborghini. This was bigger than personal retaliation. This was influence. Favoritism. Quiet manipulation stretched across years. By evening, another shift happened. 3 residents publicly challenged Victoria's statement online. Then 5. Then 9. For the first time since I moved into the community, people stopped asking what she thought and started asking for explanations. Somewhere across the lake, a distant rumble of thunder echoed through the fog. Standing there with the notebook in my hands, I realized Thursday's meeting was no longer going to be the public trial Victoria had planned. It was becoming something she feared far more. A room full of people paying attention. Thursday arrived under steady rain. Not a dramatic storm, just the kind that hangs over a lake town all day and makes everything feel heavier. Water dripped from pine branches. The gravel roads glistened. Low fog pressed against the shoreline and blurred the fishing docks into pale silhouettes. By late afternoon, pickup trucks filled the clubhouse parking lot. More vehicles than I had ever seen at an HOA meeting. People were showing up early. Not because they cared about bylaws, because they sensed something shifting. I sat alone for a few minutes before going inside, watching rain slide down the windshield. Across the lot, I spotted Victoria. Pink blazer, clipboard tucked under one arm, confident smile firmly in place. But something felt different. She kept checking her phone. every few seconds, then scanning the parking lot, then checking again. For the first time, she looked less like a queen and more like a manager trying to hold together a situation she no longer controlled. Inside, the room buzzed with quiet conversation. The smell of coffee and wet jackets filled the air. Residents who normally sat silently along the walls were clustered together talking, comparing stories, comparing dates, comparing experiences. The notebook Mark had given me stayed locked in my truck. I was not there to perform. I was there to observe. Victoria opened the meeting with her usual polished tone. She thanked everyone for attending. She spoke about protecting property values. She referenced community harmony 3 separate times. Then she turned toward me. Certain recent events have created unnecessary division. A few people exchanged looks. Nobody responded. The silence landed harder than applause. Victoria continued. Our responsibility is to focus on facts rather than rumors. That was when an older resident near the back stood up. Walter Briggs, former firefighter, lived there almost 15 years. Then let's talk facts. The room went still. Victoria smiled. Of course. Walter did not sit down. Why did I receive a warning for a boat cover while 3 other residents received nothing for the same thing? Victoria's expression barely moved. Every situation is unique. Another resident spoke. Then another. Then another. Different stories. Different years. Same answer. Same pattern. Same frustration. The meeting slowly stopped being about me. That seemed to bother Victoria more than anything. Her attention kept returning to me, trying to pull the spotlight back. But the room had moved on. People were finally talking to each other instead of through her. Then a woman I had never met stood up near the side wall. Mid-50s. Quiet voice. I think I know why Brad wants that property. Every head turned, including mine. Victoria's smile vanished for half a second. Only half a second. But everyone saw it. The woman explained that her husband had worked for a regional developer before retiring. Months ago, he overheard discussions about future waterfront expansion near the lake. Several adjacent lots could become extremely valuable if combined into a larger development project. My property sat directly in the center of the proposed area. Nobody accused Victoria of anything. Nobody needed to. The room understood the implication immediately. Suddenly, years of selective pressure looked different. The rain intensified outside, drumming against the roof while residents absorbed what they had just heard. Victoria finally interrupted. That is pure speculation. Her voice came out sharper than intended. The woman calmly nodded. Maybe. Then she sat down. The damage was already done. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, I watched genuine uncertainty cross Victoria Whitmore's face. Not panic yet. Not fear. Something earlier. Something more dangerous. The realization that people had stopped automatically believing her. The morning after the meeting felt different. Not quieter. More focused. The fog still hung low over the lake, and rain still drifted across the water in thin gray sheets. But something had shifted. For days I had been reacting. Watching. Absorbing. Letting other people reveal pieces of the puzzle. That phase was over. I spent most of Friday in my detached garage overlooking the shoreline with a coffee thermos on the workbench and every document I had collected spread across a folding table. The damage to the car was now sitting with my insurance carrier. The HOA notices sat in one stack. Meeting notes sat in another. Linda's recordings. Mark's notebook. Photos. Timelines. Names. Patterns. None of it looked dramatic by itself. Together it told a story. Around noon my insurance adjuster called. His voice was professional but curious. Mr. Cole, something unusual came up. I leaned back in my chair. What kind of unusual? Papers rustled on his end. The towing company listed in the HOA complaint submitted an authorization record. I waited. The authorization was not issued by the board. For a moment, all I could hear was rain tapping against the metal roof. Who issued it? Another pause. Victoria Whitmore personally. That changed everything. Not because it proved liability. Because it exposed risk. Huge risk. The distinction mattered. Insurance companies do not get emotional. They follow exposure. Liability. Documentation. Money. Suddenly, this was no longer a disagreement between neighbors. It was becoming a question of authority and personal responsibility. By late afternoon, another call arrived. This one from a resident I barely knew. Then another. Then another. People were no longer whispering. They were volunteering information. A retired attorney offered to explain board procedure. A former property manager described how legitimate enforcement actions were supposed to work. Nobody sounded angry anymore. They sounded concerned. Concerned communities become dangerous for people who rely on blind compliance. That evening I drove into town. Rain covered the courthouse steps in a reflective sheen. Across the street a diner glowed through the weather. I met with a local attorney named Rebecca Lang. Mid-50s. Sharp. Calm. The kind of person who listened longer than she talked. I expected a conversation about vehicle damage. Instead, she spent 20 minutes asking questions about governance, approvals, authority chains, and insurance exposure. Finally, she closed her notebook. You are looking at this as a property dispute. What should I be looking at? She folded her hands. Institutional liability. The words landed differently than anything I had heard all week. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the lake basin. Rebecca continued. If board authority was misrepresented, if enforcement procedures were bypassed, and if residents acted based on those representations, the exposure becomes much larger than a damaged vehicle. For the first time since this started, I was not thinking about what Victoria had done. I was thinking about what she was afraid of. When I returned home after dark, headlights moved slowly through the neighborhood. Residents stood on porches talking despite the weather. The social balance was changing. People who once avoided eye contact now waved. Others openly discussed the meeting. Victoria's supporters had grown quieter. Her critics had grown bolder. Then just before midnight an email appeared in my inbox from an anonymous address. No message. No explanation. Only a single attachment. I opened it. It was a scanned site map of the waterfront properties surrounding the lake. Several parcels were highlighted in yellow, including mine, and written across the corner in red marker were 4 words that immediately made my pulse slow instead of rise. Phase 2 acquisition target. Saturday morning arrived under a ceiling of low clouds that turned the lake into a sheet of dark steel. Fog drifted across the water and wrapped itself around the fishing docks. The air smelled like wet cedar and rain-soaked earth. I barely noticed. My attention stayed fixed on the anonymous site map sitting on the kitchen table. Phase 2 acquisition target. For words. That was all it took to transform weeks of suspicion into something far more concrete. Not proof. Direction. By mid-morning the neighborhood was already talking. People gathered in small circles near mailboxes, walking trails, and gravel driveways. Conversations stopped when others approached, then started again a few feet later. The difference now was obvious. The gossip no longer centered on me. It centered on Victoria. Around noon, I drove to the clubhouse for a community landscaping volunteer event that normally attracted 20 people. More than 50 showed up. Not because they cared about mulch. They wanted to see who stood where. Social pressure had become visible. Residents who once followed Victoria automatically now avoided standing beside her. Others nodded politely and kept moving. The shift was subtle but impossible to miss. Victoria arrived 10 minutes late, wearing her usual polished smile. For years that smile had controlled rooms. This time it barely controlled a conversation. She moved from group to group, offering explanations nobody had requested. There has been a lot of misunderstanding lately. People are jumping to conclusions. Some residents are creating unnecessary drama. Each sentence sounded practiced. Each sounded weaker than the one before. People listened politely, then changed the subject. That was the moment I realized her authority was no longer collapsing because of evidence. It was collapsing because of trust. And trust, once gone, does not return on command. Halfway through the event, I found myself standing beside Walter Briggs near the shoreline. Rain threatened in the distance. The muddy bank sloped toward the water where small waves pushed against old wooden posts. Walter watched Victoria across the lawn. You know what changed? He asked. What? He folded his arms. People stopped being afraid of being alone. That sentence stayed with me. Because it was true. One resident speaking up can be dismissed. 20 residents speaking up becomes a community. Not long after that, another unexpected thing happened. Brad arrived. Loud truck. Loud entrance. Same confidence. But the reaction was different now. Conversations died when he approached. Nobody greeted him. Nobody laughed at his jokes. Nobody asked about his weekend plans. Silence followed him from group to group like a shadow. Social isolation had begun. He felt it immediately. You could see it in the irritation on his face. At one point he walked directly toward me. Enjoying your little publicity tour? He asked. His tone carried more frustration than confidence. I took a sip of coffee from my thermos. I came here to help plant shrubs. Several residents overheard the exchange. Nobody came to his defense. Nobody challenged me either. They simply watched. Brad looked around and seemed surprised by what he saw. Empty space. People turning away. Support disappearing. Then he muttered something under his breath and walked off. Across the lawn, Victoria saw the entire interaction. For a brief moment, our eyes met. The smile was still there, but now it looked forced. Behind it sat something new. Concern. Real concern. By evening, the community page exploded again. Residents shared meeting experiences. Former volunteers described being pressured into supporting decisions they never fully understood. Even longtime supporters started asking questions. Not accusations. Questions. Sometimes questions are worse. Late that night, while rain tapped against the metal roof and thunder rolled across the lake, I received a message from an unknown number. Only one sentence appeared on the screen. The waterfront project meeting was never supposed to become public. Then another message arrived 30 seconds later. Victoria is not the person who started it. The message stayed on my screen long after midnight, while rain drifted across the lake and fog pressed against the windows like something alive. Victoria is not the person who started it. I read the sentence at least 10 times. By sunrise, the weather had not improved. Neither had the mood in the neighborhood. The community page had turned into something I had never seen before. Residents were no longer debating whether there was a problem. They were debating how long the problem had existed. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Who benefited? Who approved what? Who knew? By mid-morning, another notice appeared from the HOA board announcing an emergency meeting for Sunday afternoon. The language was formal, urgent, defensive. That alone told me enough. People only rush meetings when they are losing control of the narrative. The clubhouse parking lot was already full 30 minutes before the meeting began. Pickup trucks lined the gravel shoulders. Residents stood under umbrellas speaking in low voices. Nobody seemed interested in small talk. The atmosphere felt closer to a courthouse than a neighborhood gathering. Inside, tension hung over the room. Victoria sat at the front table with 3 board members. Her smile was present, but thinner now. Every movement looked calculated. Every glance looked tired. Then something unexpected happened. 2 county vehicles pulled into the lot outside. Conversation stopped almost immediately. Through the rain-streaked windows, everyone watched the doors open. A county compliance investigator stepped out alongside a sheriff's deputy. No lights, no drama, just presence. Sometimes presence is enough. A wave of whispers moved through the room. Victoria visibly stiffened. The investigator entered first and quietly introduced herself. Professional, calm. She explained that several complaints involving governance procedures, enforcement authority, and property-related actions had been submitted for review. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody made accusations. The effect was still immediate. The room changed. For years, Victoria had been the highest authority most residents ever dealt with. Suddenly, she was not. The investigator requested access to several meeting records and enforcement files. One board member immediately looked down at the table. Another removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. The sheriff remained near the back wall, silent and observant. Victoria attempted to recover control. "We are fully cooperative," she said. "Unfortunately, recent misinformation has caused unnecessary confusion." The investigator nodded politely. "That is precisely why we review documentation." The silence that followed was devastating. Not hostile. Worse, disappointed. Around the room, people exchanged looks. Nobody rushed to defend her. Nobody applauded. Nobody supported the statement. The social authority she had relied on for years simply failed to appear. Then another surprise surfaced. Gary Holloway stood up and formally requested a temporary suspension of all discretionary enforcement actions until the review concluded. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then another board member supported the motion. Then a third. Victoria stared at them in disbelief. The vote passed. Residents did not cheer. They did not need to. Relief spread across the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. As the meeting ended and people filed into the rainy afternoon, the investigator approached me briefly. "Mr. Cole," she said quietly, "you may want to keep that site map." I looked at her. "Why?" She paused. "Because it already appeared in another file we received this morning." Then she walked away, standing under the gray sky beside the lake. I realized the story had just grown much bigger than the HOA. The county review moved faster than anyone expected. 3 weeks later, the fog still rolled across the lake every morning, but the mood in the neighborhood had changed completely. The clubhouse felt smaller somehow, quieter. The same residents who once lowered their voices whenever Victoria Whitmore walked by now spoke openly. Questions had become findings. Findings had become consequences. The county investigators' review confirmed multiple governance irregularities, unauthorized enforcement actions, and procedural violations that exposed the association to significant liability. The board's insurance carrier launched its own review. The towing authorization connected to my vehicle became part of that discussion. So did several other enforcement decisions that had never received proper approval. One by one, the people who had quietly supported Victoria began creating distance between themselves and her. Nobody wanted ownership of decisions they had once defended. The real turning point came during the final special meeting. Rain tapped against the clubhouse roof while residents filled every chair. Victoria arrived with the same clipboard she had carried for years, but the room no longer reacted to it. Authority had vanished from the object because authority had vanished from the person holding it. When questions began, nobody argued. Nobody shouted. That was the remarkable part. Residents simply asked for explanations. Dates, votes, authorizations, records. The silence after each answer grew heavier than any confrontation could have been. At one point, Victoria looked around the room and said, "Everything I did was for this community." A year earlier, that sentence might have worked. This time, nobody responded. Not because they were angry, because they no longer believed her. The board accepted her resignation before the evening ended. Brad left through a side door before the meeting concluded. The room noticed. Nobody followed. A few days later, the larger picture finally surfaced. The waterfront acquisition plan had not started with Victoria. A private development group had quietly explored future opportunities around the lake years earlier. Several parcels, including mine, sat in a strategically valuable corridor. Nothing illegal about the concept itself. The problem was how aggressively certain individuals had attempted to influence outcomes once property owners refused to cooperate. The exposure frightened everyone involved. Plans were abandoned. Meetings ended. Partnerships dissolved. The story died in boardrooms the same way it had begun. Quietly. The legal matters concluded over time. Insurance covered the vehicle damage. Additional settlements resolved other disputes involving residents. The association adopted independent oversight measures and revised enforcement procedures. More importantly, people stopped living in fear of receiving the next selective warning letter. One cold morning several months later, I stood inside my garage overlooking the shoreline. The Lamborghini had been fully restored. The paint reflected the pale sunlight coming through the open door. Outside, fog drifted over the water and the fishing docks emerged slowly from the mist. The same view I had looked at during the worst days of the conflict now felt peaceful again. For the first time in a long while, the property felt like mine instead of a battlefield. Walter Briggs stopped by carrying coffee. We stood quietly for a minute watching the lake. Finally, he smiled. "Looks different now." I nodded. "No, same lake." He laughed. "Maybe it is the people that changed." Maybe he was right. Looking back, the story was never really about a car. It started with public humiliation, moved through manipulation, fear, social pressure, hidden agendas, governance failures, and finally accountability. Along the way, residents discovered that silence protects power far more effectively than rules ever do. When people compared notes, shared experiences, and stopped standing alone, the balance shifted. The social revenge came first as support disappeared from those who abused trust. The legal revenge followed through reviews, liability exposure, and institutional accountability. Emotional healing arrived last, when ordinary people no longer felt intimidated in their own neighborhood. The public humiliation was not dramatic. It was reflective. The people who once demanded unquestioned authority found themselves answering questions instead. The lesson is simple. Confidence is not the same thing as legitimacy. Authority is not ownership. And communities work best when transparency matters more than personalities. The final image I remember is not a meeting room, a legal document, or a damaged vehicle. It is a quiet shoreline at sunrise, fog lifting off the water, a restored garage door standing open, and a neighborhood finally at peace with itself. If you enjoyed this story, rank the story from 10 to 0. I would love to know what you think. As for me, every time I look across that lake, I am reminded that patience, documentation, and calm persistence can outlast even the loudest voice in the room. And somewhere beyond the far shoreline, where the fog still hides more than it reveals, I sometimes wonder how many other communities are only one conversation away from discovering the truth.